Brown eyes are often treated as the ordinary human default, yet that familiarity hides a colder possibility. The traits most common today may be only the survivors of vanished populations, lost climates, and genetic paths that disappeared without leaving a complete record, so the colour in your iris may carry an echo of an ancient story we can no longer fully recover. Could brown eyes, the trait so often called dominant, be hiding a 500,000-year secret? Most people have looked into a pair of brown eyes. Brown is familiar. It appears in families and in faces from many inhabited regions of the world. Because it is common, it is easy to mistake it for something simple. Yet the ordinary often hides the longest history. A brown iris is not merely a colour placed on the surface of the eye. It is the result of cells, pigments, inherited instructions, and generations of survival that began long before any family name, language, city, or nation existed. When you look at brown eyes, you are not seeing a fixed label. You are seeing a living outcome produced by biology and time. The darkness can be deep or warm, almost black in dim light, amber near a window, or patterned with lighter rings and flecks. Two people may both be described as brown-eyed while their irises differ in texture, tone, and the way they reflect light. The word brown gathers many variations into one simple category, and that simplicity can hide how much is happening beneath it. Human beings are drawn to clear boxes because clear boxes are easy to remember. We say brown, blue, green, or grey, as though nature has painted each eye with a single decision. In reality, colour emerges from gradual differences in pigment and structure. What looks like one stable trait is formed by many small biological influences working together. This matters because the story of brown eyes cannot be reduced to a single gene, a single ancestor, or a single moment in the distant past. The trait is widespread, but widespread does not mean unchanged. It may be ancient, but ancient does not mean frozen. Every generation reshuffles inherited material. Populations move, divide, shrink, expand, and meet again. Some genetic variations continue, others become rare. Many disappear when the people carrying them leave no descendants. The faces alive today, therefore, show only a surviving fraction of the range that once existed. This is one reason a familiar eye colour can point toward a hidden history. The eye itself does not preserve memories in the way a written record does. It cannot tell us where one person's ancestors stood thousands of years ago, what language they spoke, or how they understood the world. But it can reveal that the body carries traces of processes far older than conscious memory. Pigment production, inherited variation, and the development of the iris belong to biological systems shaped across immense stretches of time. Brown eyes are one present expression of those systems, not a complete record of them. The deeper question begins here. If brown eyes are so common, are they common because they are biologically stronger, because they are older, because chance preserved them, or because several forces acted differently in different populations? The word dominant seems to offer an easy answer, but it may also mislead. In genetics, dominance describes how certain inherited variants can influence an observable trait when paired with others. It does not mean superior, inevitable, or destined to replace every alternative. That distinction is important because the history of human appearance is not a contest with one final winner. It is a changing pattern created by inheritance, environment, migration, isolation, and chance. Long before modern humans spread across the planet, earlier human populations lived through climates and landscapes that repeatedly changed. Their bodies carried pigment systems inherited from still older ancestors. Some of those lines contributed to later populations. Others vanished. We cannot look directly into their eyes, and fossils rarely preserve the soft tissues that would show their colour. What remains is incomplete. Fragments of DNA, patterns among living people, and cautious comparisons across species and populations. From those fragments, science can reconstruct possibilities, but not every face. So the most familiar colour in the human gaze may be familiar precisely because so much else was lost before anyone could remember it. Brown is not a substance painted onto the eye. It is an effect created when light enters the iris and meets living tissue containing pigment. The iris is the coloured ring surrounding the pupil, and its appearance depends largely on how much melanin is present, where that melanin is concentrated, and how the microscopic structure of the tissue scatters light. In eyes that appear brown, the front layers of the iris generally contain more melanin than in eyes that appear blue or grey. This greater concentration absorbs more of the incoming light. Less light is scattered back toward the observer, so the iris appears darker, warmer, and more solid in colour. Yet even this explanation must remain careful, because no two irises are built in exactly the same way. Some contain dense pigment across most of the visible surface. Others show lighter rings around the pupil, darker edges, faint radial lines, or small areas where the colour changes. These patterns are not signs that one eye is unfinished. They are ordinary results of biological variation. The word brown therefore describes a range rather than a single shade. Under weak light, a medium brown eye may seem nearly black because the pupil widens and the surrounding iris reflects little light. In sunlight, the same eye may reveal copper, amber, or golden tones that were always present but difficult to see. What changes is not the underlying identity of the eye, but the conditions in which it is observed. Human perception simplifies these differences because the brain prefers stable categories. It turns a changing play of light, tissue, and pigment into a familiar word. That word is useful, but it can make the biology appear more fixed than it is. Melanin itself is also part of a wider system. Related pigments help colour the skin, hair, and eyes. Although these features are not controlled in exactly the same way, a person may have dark eyes and lighter hair, or light eyes and deeply pigmented skin, because different tissues regulate pigment through overlapping but distinct genetic pathways. The body does not follow a single colour program. It develops each feature through networks of inherited instructions, cellular activity, and local tissue structure. Brown eyes are one outcome within that network. They do not carry a separate brown material that lighter eyes lack. Instead, all normal human irises share the same basic anatomy, while differences in pigment quantity and light scattering create the colours we recognise. This shared foundation matters when thinking about human origins. The visible contrast between brown and blue eyes can seem large, but biologically the difference is built from variations within the same organ and the same ancient pigment machinery. Long before people named colours, classified populations, or imagined social meanings for appearance, these cells were already producing and distributing melanin. The process belonged to the body before it belonged to language. That history reaches far beyond the age of cities and written records. It connects modern eyes with older human populations and, more distantly, with pigment systems inherited from earlier ancestors. Science can study the molecules and tissues involved, but it cannot recover every shade that once existed in vanished people. Soft tissue rarely survives, and ancient DNA is available from only a small fraction of the individuals who lived. The colours visible today are therefore not a complete gallery of the past. They are the colours carried forward by surviving lines of descent. Brown appears common not because nature selected one perfect shade and stopped changing, but because many populations preserved combinations that produce substantial iris pigmentation. The result looks simple only from a distance. Up close, brown eyes are a meeting point between light, cells, inherited variation, and a human history much older than the names we use to describe it. Their apparent stillness conceals a biological process renewed in every child and reshaped through every passing generation. The word dominant carries a weight that biology never intended. In ordinary language, it suggests power, victory, control, or the ability to push something weaker aside. When people hear that brown eyes are dominant, they may imagine that brown is the stronger colour, the older colour, or the colour most likely to erase every alternative. None of those ideas follows automatically from the scientific meaning of the word. In genetics, dominance describes what can be observed when certain inherited variants occur together. It does not measure quality, health, intelligence, age, or evolutionary importance. A dominant variant is not necessarily more common, and a recessive variant is not necessarily rare. A trait can remain uncommon even when one of its contributing variants behaves dominantly, while a recessive trait can become widespread in a population under the right historical conditions. Frequency depends on which variants people carry, how populations have changed, and how chance has acted across generations. The label therefore tells us something limited about inheritance, not the fate of humanity. Brown eyes also resist the simple lesson many people remember from school. The familiar diagram often presents one brown version and one blue version, with brown appearing whenever it is present. That model can be useful for introducing the idea of inheritance, but real eye color is shaped by several genetic influences, especially those that affect the production, movement, and regulation of pigment. Different combinations can produce a broad range of visible results, and family outcomes do not always fit the neat prediction of a single pair of letters. This complexity does not make inheritance mysterious. It simply means that the body is built through interacting instructions, rather than one isolated switch. The same caution applies to the deep past. Calling brown eyes dominant cannot tell us exactly what the eyes of people living hundreds of thousands of years ago looked like. It cannot identify the first person with a brown iris, and it cannot prove that every ancient human population shared the same shade. Researchers can compare living genetic variation, study ancient DNA when it survives, and examine the evolution of pigment systems across related populations and species. Even so, much of the record is missing. Most individuals left no recoverable DNA, and the soft tissue of the eye almost never remains. The past cannot be filled by repeating a classroom rule with greater confidence. What can be said more safely is that substantial iris pigmentation belongs to an old biological system, and that the combinations producing brown eyes have been carried through many lines of human descent. Their survival does not mean they defeated other colors in a direct contest. Populations were separated by distance, reduced by hardship, enlarged by migration, and joined through contact. In each setting, inherited variants changed in frequency for different reasons. Some changes may have involved natural selection, others may have followed founder effects, population bottlenecks, or ordinary reproductive chance. A visible feature at the end of this process can look inevitable, although nothing about its path was guaranteed. This is the first lesson hidden inside the familiar phrase dominant brown eyes. The phrase sounds like a conclusion, but is only the beginning of a more careful question. Brown eyes are common across much of the world, yet commonness is a historical outcome rather than proof of superiority. Their color is produced by ancient pigment machinery, yet an ancient system can generate changing forms. Their inheritance can sometimes appear predictable, yet the genes involved form a network more complex than a single dominant command. Once these distinctions are made, the eye in the mirror begins to look different. It remains calm, ordinary, and physically unchanged, but the idea attached to it has shifted. What seemed like a simple sign of genetic strength becomes evidence of continuity, variation, and loss, preserved through countless generations whose individual faces can never be recovered or known. The colored ring around the pupil looks still, but it is a living structure that is constantly responding to light. The iris is a thin circle of tissue placed in front of the lens and behind the clear surface of the eye. At its center is the pupil, which is not a black object but an opening through which light travels deeper into the eye. In bright surroundings, muscles within the iris narrow that opening. In darkness, other muscles widen it. The movement is usually automatic, guided by the nervous system before conscious thought has time to notice. What we call eye color belongs to this responsive ring, not to the pupil itself. The iris contains several layers, and each contributes to the way the eye appears. Its front surface has a delicate arrangement of fibers, cells, grooves, and small depressions. Beneath that surface lie blood vessels, connective tissue, and pigment-producing cells. Farther back is a darker layer that helps prevent stray light from passing through the iris. Together, these tissues control the amount of light entering the eye while also creating the patterns that make each iris visually distinctive. Brown eyes often appear smooth from a distance, yet close observation reveals radial lines extending outward from the pupil, darker borders near the edge, and subtle variations in tone. These details arise from anatomy, not decoration. They are traces of how the tissue formed before birth and how pigment became distributed across it. The iris begins developing early in the body, under the direction of inherited instructions shared with many other tissues of the eye. Its basic plan is common to all normal human eyes, regardless of color. The visible differences emerge within that shared plan. This is important for understanding human origins, because it reminds us that brown, blue, green, and grey eyes are not separate organs created by separate histories. They are variations produced within one inherited structure, carried by populations whose ancestors were connected long before modern categories existed. The iris also shows why appearances can mislead. A darker eye may seem to contain a thicker or fundamentally different substance, but the main differences are usually found in pigment levels and how light behaves within the tissue. The muscles, vessels, nerves, and supporting cells perform similar tasks across eye colors. The eye must regulate light, protect deeper structures, and help form a clear image. Color is visible to an observer, but the iris first exists within the eye's wider working sensory system. Its function began long before humans used eye color to describe families or divide strangers into groups. Earlier human populations depended on the same basic need to manage light as they moved through changing landscapes. Their irises opened in shade and narrowed under bright skies, even though no surviving record can show every color those irises displayed. Fossils preserve bone and teeth far more readily than soft tissue, while DNA survives only under limited conditions. This leaves a gap between the anatomy we can study in living people and the eyes that once looked across ancient environments. Scientists can infer fragments of that history through genetics and comparison, but the complete range of past appearances is gone. The living iris therefore offers both evidence and limitation. It shows that modern eye colors arise from a deeply shared biological design, yet it cannot reveal every path by which that design reached the present. A brown eye is not simply a dark circle surrounding a pupil. It is a small muscular organ, a field of pigment, a regulator of light, and a surviving expression of an older human inheritance. Within that quiet ring, ordinary anatomy preserves continuity across generations, even while migration, isolation, and chance alter the visible colors carried into each future generation. Its surface holds no written story, but its structure points backward toward bodies that saw the world before history could record them. Melanin does not create brown eyes by acting like paint. It changes what happens to light after that light reaches the iris. When light enters the eye, some of it is absorbed, some is reflected, and some is scattered by the microscopic arrangement of tissue. In an iris with more melanin near the front, a greater share of incoming light is absorbed before it can scatter back toward an observer. The eye therefore appears darker. In an iris with less melanin in those front layers, more light is scattered within the tissue, and lighter colors can become visible. This is why blue eyes do not contain blue pigment, in the same way brown eyes contain more visible melanin. Their color depends strongly on the way light is dispersed through the iris. Brown eyes, by contrast, usually return less scattered light, so their appearance is shaped more directly by pigment density. Even then, brown is not one uniform result. The amount of melanin can vary gradually, and the tissue can distribute it unevenly. Some irises appear almost black under weak illumination. Others reveal honey, copper, chestnut, or amber tones when bright light reaches them from the side. These changes do not mean the pigment itself is transforming from one moment to the next. They show how the same tissue can look different as the angle, strength, and color of light change. The observer also matters. Human vision interprets color by comparing one area with another and by adjusting to surrounding brightness. A brown eye seen beside pale skin, dark hair, or a blue garment may seem slightly different even though its biology remains the same. What people call eye color is therefore a meeting between physical tissue and perception. This meeting begins with ancient biology. Melanin is produced by specialized cells through chemical pathways that existed long before modern humans appeared. Related pigment systems are found across many living species, although the forms, locations, and functions differ. In the human body, melanin contributes to visible variation in the skin, hair, and eyes, but each tissue controls its pigment in its own way. The amount of melanin in the iris cannot be read as a simple measure of pigment elsewhere in the body. Dark eyes can occur with many skin tones and hair colors because the genetic instructions affecting these tissues overlap without being identical. That complexity is a reminder of human beginnings. Our ancestors did not inherit a single switch marked dark or light. They inherited networks that regulated pigment in different cells at different stages of development and in response to different biological needs. Across generations, small changes within those networks created new combinations. Migration moved those combinations into new populations. Isolation sometimes increased their frequency. Contact brought previously separated lineages together again. The brown eyes seen today are outcomes of that long movement, not untouched copies of one ancient pair of eyes. Science can describe how melanin absorbs light and how iris structure influences scattering with considerable confidence. It can also identify many genetic regions involved in pigmentation. What it cannot do is reconstruct the exact color of every vanished population or assign one simple evolutionary reason to every shade. Ancient DNA is incomplete, and most people who ever lived left no usable genetic record. The visible world of past eyes has largely disappeared with the soft tissues that carried it. Yet the mechanism still operating in living eyes gives us a quiet connection to that lost range. Each time light falls across a brown iris, it reveals an ancient pigment system working in a modern body. It also reminds us that a common appearance can preserve continuity without preserving a complete history, because continuity belongs to the process while individual faces and populations are repeatedly lost. The color seems fixed, but what we see is an active exchange between light, tissue, and inherited biology, repeated in every glance. No two brown irises are exact copies of one another. From across a room, many may seem nearly identical, especially when the light is soft and the pupil is wide. Closer observation reveals a different reality. One iris may hold fine spokes extending outward from the pupil. Another may contain darker rings, pale clouds, tiny freckles, or a border that becomes almost black near the white of the eye. Some are evenly colored, while others shift from deep brown at the edge to amber near the center. These patterns arise as the iris develops, when cells, fibers, blood vessels, and pigment become arranged within the same basic human structure. They do not form a secret code that can identify personality, intelligence, or ancestry. They are ordinary variations produced by living tissue. Even the boundary between brown and other named colors is less precise than everyday language suggests. Hazel eyes may contain areas that appear brown, gold, or green under different conditions. Amber eyes may look light brown in one setting and distinctly golden in another. Very dark brown eyes are often called black. Although a truly black human iris is not the usual biological reality, the names depend on culture, lighting, surrounding colors, and the observer's expectations. Nature does not divide the iris according to the small set of words available in a language. It produces continuous differences, while people draw borders across that continuity. This is why counting eye colors across populations is more difficult than it first appears. Researchers must decide how colors will be classified, and different methods can place the same eye into different categories. Photographs may be affected by cameras and illumination. Self-descriptions may follow local habits. A person described as brown-eyed in one study might be placed in a hazel or intermediate group in another. These limits do not make the research useless, but they remind us that visible traits are often more fluid than the labels used to measure them. The variation also reaches back toward human origins. Every iris forms through inherited biological instructions, but those instructions are not copied as one unchanging package. They are combined anew in each child. The child receives genetic material from both parents, and the resulting network influences pigment production, tissue structure, and the final appearance of the eye. Across many generations, recombination creates combinations that may not have appeared in exactly the same form before. A modern brown iris is therefore not a preserved replica of an ancient ancestor's eye. It is a new expression built from inherited material with a much older history. This distinction protects us from imagining evolution as a museum of unchanged features. The pigment system can be ancient, while every individual result remains unique. Populations can carry long-standing tendencies toward darker iris pigmentation, without all members having the same color or pattern. When populations meet, inherited variants enter new combinations. When populations become small or isolated, chance can make some combinations more frequent and others less common. Over enough time, many visible arrangements disappear because the people who carried them leave no continuing line. The surviving range becomes the only range we can see, creating the illusion that it was always complete. Each living eye therefore remains connected to ancient humanity, while belonging entirely to its own moment. Brown eyes quietly challenge that illusion. Their many shades and internal patterns show that a common trait contains more variation than a simple name admits. Their shared anatomy shows continuity with earlier humans, while their individual differences reveal constant reshuffling across families and generations. Looking closely at one brown iris cannot recover the faces of vanished populations, but it can teach a more careful lesson. The past is not stored as a perfect picture inside the eye. It survives as a changing biological process, producing familiar colours through combinations that have never been repeated in precisely the same way. Many people first learn about eye colour through a small square drawn on a classroom page. One parent contributes a letter, the other parent contributes another, and the two letters are placed together to predict the child's appearance. Brown is often represented by a capital letter and blue by a lowercase one. In this model, a child with at least one brown version is expected to have brown eyes, while blue eyes appear only when two blue versions are inherited. The diagram is clear, memorable, and useful for introducing the idea that children receive genetic material from both parents. Its weakness is not that it is entirely false, but that it compresses a complex biological system into a single pair of symbols. Real eye color does not arise from one isolated instruction acting alone. It develops through the combined influence of several genetic regions that affect how pigment is produced, transported, stored, and regulated within the iris. Some of these influences are stronger than others, and some interact in ways that change the visible result. The classroom square removes those interactions so that a basic principle can be understood. Trouble begins when the teaching model is mistaken for a complete description of human inheritance. Families sometimes notice outcomes that seem to break the rule. Two brown-eyed parents may have a child with lighter eyes. Siblings may inherit noticeably different shades, even though they share the same parents. An iris may fall between familiar categories, appearing hazel, amber, greenish-brown, or dark grey depending on how it is observed. These outcomes do not mean genetics has failed. They show that the simple diagram left out many contributing factors. The same lesson applies when people look backward toward ancient human origins. A single dominant letter cannot reconstruct the eye colours of populations that lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. It cannot tell us whether every group carried the same combinations, how common a particular shade was, or which variations disappeared when populations became small or vanished. The model describes a narrow pattern of inheritance under simplified conditions. Deep history involves changing populations, many interacting genes, and an incomplete record. The word dominant can make the square seem more powerful than it is. Because brown is placed above blue in the diagram, people may imagine a permanent hierarchy in which brown always advances and lighter colours slowly retreat. Yet inheritance does not move toward a planned final state. Each generation receives combinations from the people who became its parents, and those combinations are shaped by migration, isolation, population size, and chance. A recessive variant can remain hidden in people whose visible eyes are brown, then appear when two carriers have a child. A visible trait can therefore disappear for several generations without its contributing variants leaving the family. It may return later, not as a new mutation but as an old inheritance brought together again. This hidden continuity is one reason eye color has often seemed mysterious. The body carries more information than appearance alone reveals. A brown iris shows the outcome of one genetic combination, but it does not display every variant present in the person who has it, nor does it reveal the full history of those variants before they entered that individual. The school model gives a useful doorway into heredity, but the doorway is narrower than the landscape beyond it. To understand why brown eyes became so common, why lighter eyes remain, and why the past cannot be reduced to a single ancient colour, the simple square must eventually give way to a network. That network preserves the same basic truth taught in the classroom, that inheritance passes through families, while revealing that what is passed on is far richer than two letters on a page. Across long stretches of human time, that hidden richness was repeatedly rearranged, carried onward by some lineages and lost with others. Beyond the classroom square, two genetic regions have become especially important in the study of human eye colour. They are known as OCA2 and HERC2, and they lie close together on the same chromosome. Their relationship helps explain why a simple brown versus blue rule can sometimes appear to work, even though the true biology is more complex. OCA2 contains instructions involved in the handling of pigment inside specialized cells. When its activity changes, the amount of melanin produced or stored in the iris can also change. More melanin in the front layers of the iris usually contributes to darker eyes, while reduced pigment can allow more light to scatter and create lighter appearances. HERC2 does not simply make a separate eye color. Certain variations within it can influence how strongly OCA2 is used in iris cells, acting more like a regulatory control than a paint box. This interaction became especially well studied because one region within HERC2 is strongly associated with blue and brown eye differences in many people of European ancestry. Yet even here, caution is necessary. A strong association is not the same as complete control. The same variant may not predict an identical shade in every person, and its importance can differ among populations with different genetic backgrounds. Brown eyes cannot be reduced to the presence of one dominant command, just as lighter eyes cannot be reduced to the absence of one. The body reads many inherited signals together. Some affect pigment production directly. Others influence the development of pigment cells, the movement of melanin within those cells, or the microscopic structure through which light travels. OCA2 and HERC2 occupy a central place in this network, but they do not stand alone. Their importance also reveals something about the deep human past. Genetic variation is not created with a label describing the future appearance it will produce. A change arises, enters a population, and is carried through generations if the people who inherit it have descendants. Its frequency may rise, fall, or remain limited for reasons that include population size, migration, isolation, and chance. Later, when separate groups meet, the variant can enter new genetic backgrounds and contribute to results that did not exist in precisely the same combination before. This means that the history of eye color is not the history of one gene moving steadily toward a final destination. It is the history of interacting variations traveling through shifting human populations. Researchers can compare these patterns among living people and, when preservation allows, examine ancient DNA. From that evidence, they can estimate how certain pigment-related variants were distributed in particular individuals or communities. But these estimates remain incomplete. Many ancient people left no recoverable DNA, and the relationship between a genetic prediction and the exact shade of a living iris is never perfect. A sequence can suggest a probability, not restore the lost eye itself. This limitation becomes even greater when looking hundreds of thousands of years into human origins. The farther back the question reaches, the fewer direct genetic records survive. Scientists must rely more heavily on comparisons, evolutionary relationships, and cautious inference. OCA2 and HERC2 therefore offer a powerful lesson without offering a complete answer. They show that a visible trait can depend on regulation as much as on a pigment-producing instruction. They show how one region of DNA can influence the activity of another. Most importantly, they show why the word dominant can hide more than it reveals. Brown eyes may often result when combinations support substantial melanin in the iris, but the route to that result passes through a network shaped by both molecular interaction and population history. What appears on the face is only the final visible surface of that deeper process. Behind each brown iris stands not one ancestral instruction, but a layered inheritance whose surviving combinations have been tested, rearranged, and carried across countless successive human generations over time. Eye color becomes easier to understand when it is seen as the result of many genetic influences working together rather than a contest between one brown instruction and one blue instruction. OCA2 and HERC2 have strong effects, but several other genes also contribute to the amount, movement, and storage of melanin in the iris. Some influence pigment production, others affect the development of pigment cells or the way those cells organize melanin within the tissue. Each influence may be modest on its own, yet the combined outcome can shift an eye toward deeper brown, lighter brown, hazel, green, grey, or blue. This is why people with similar ancestry can still show different shades, and why siblings can inherit noticeably different eyes from the same parents. Each child receives a new combination of genetic variants. The parents do not pass down a complete copy of their own visible appearance. They pass on chromosomes that have been reshuffled through reproduction, carrying variants that may not be obvious in either parent's face. A brown-eyed person can carry variants associated with reduced iris pigmentation while still having enough pigment-producing influences to appear brown. If another parent carries similar hidden variants, a child may inherit a combination that produces lighter eyes. Nothing has skipped the rules. The rules were simply more numerous than the classroom model allowed. This network also explains why prediction is never perfect. Genetic tests can estimate eye color with useful accuracy in some populations, especially when they include several well-studied markers. But they cannot always identify the exact shade. The same combination may look slightly different because of additional variants, tissue structure, age, and the conditions under which the eye is observed. Categories such as brown or blue simplify a continuous range, so even a biologically sound prediction must eventually be translated into human labels that do not capture every detail. Across deep human time, this complexity would have been carried through populations in changing combinations. Groups that became separated could accumulate different frequencies of pigment-related variants. Small communities might lose some variants simply through chance. Expanding populations could carry a limited sample into new regions. Later contact could bring old variants together in new ways. The visible result in any one era would reflect both inherited biology and the demographic history of the people who survived to reproduce. This is why modern brown eyes cannot be treated as a single ancient package preserved without change for hundreds of thousands of years. The pigment system is ancient, but the combinations seen today are products of repeated reshuffling. Some may have deep continuity. Others may have become common more recently within specific populations. Many combinations that once existed were probably lost when lineages disappeared, although science cannot list them all or recover their exact appearances. The surviving gene pool contains only what passed through the narrow doorway of ancestry into the present. It also warns against reading ancestry directly from color. Similar shades can arise from different combinations, while related people can display different shades. A brown iris cannot identify a nation, culture, or single ancestral population. It records only one visible outcome of a network shared across humanity and altered through time in every generation. Understanding eye color as polygenic changes the meaning of dominance. Brown remains a useful descriptive category, and some genetic variants strongly favor greater iris pigmentation, but no single letter commands the entire outcome. The visible eye emerges from interaction, not from one isolated order. That interaction reaches from molecules inside pigment cells to family inheritance, and from family inheritance to the movement and survival of populations. The eye in the mirror, therefore, carries no simple message about superiority or purity. It shows a temporary arrangement of ancient biological tools assembled in one person through a chain of generations that preserved some variants, combined others, and allowed countless alternatives to disappear beyond recovery. Long before the first modern human face appeared, pigment was already part of life. Melanin and related biological systems did not begin with Homo sapiens, and they were not created for the purpose of producing the eye colors that people recognize today. Pigment had much older roles in living organisms, including helping tissues manage light, contributing to visible coloration, and supporting the development of specialized cells. Across vertebrate evolution, pigment cells became part of the skin, hair, feathers, scales, and eyes in different ways. The exact forms varied among lineages, but the underlying principle was ancient. Living tissue could produce, store, and distribute molecules that changed how light was absorbed and reflected. Human eyes inherited this deep biological foundation. The iris did not suddenly acquire color when our species emerged. It developed from structures and cellular processes already present in earlier ancestors. This matters because the history of brown eyes cannot be separated from the longer history of the eye itself. Before there were human populations moving between continents, before language named one iris brown and another blue, the basic machinery for producing pigment had been operating for immense stretches of evolutionary time. Modern humans inherited that machinery, then carried different genetic variations within it as populations expanded, separated, and met again. The result was not the invention of pigment, but the reshaping of an older system. Earlier members of the human family almost certainly possessed functioning pigment pathways, because these pathways are fundamental to normal eye development and are shared across our species and close relatives. Yet science must remain careful when moving from that general conclusion to the exact appearance of ancient individuals. Knowing that a population carried pigment-related genes does not reveal the precise shade of every iris. A darker or lighter appearance depends on many interacting influences, and most ancient people left no preserved DNA that could be examined. Even when fragments survive, they may not contain all the genetic information needed for a confident prediction. The ancient system is therefore easier to recognize than the ancient face. We can trace broad continuity in biology while still admitting that countless individual colors have disappeared. This is one of the quiet losses hidden inside human evolution. Every vanished population may have carried combinations that no longer exist. Some may have differed only slightly from living people, while others may have included patterns or frequencies that cannot now be reconstructed. It would be misleading to imagine a single original eye color shared unchanged by all early humans. Populations were never perfectly uniform, and evolution does not preserve one fixed ancestral template. Variation arises, is inherited, and is repeatedly reshaped by population history. Brown eyes today may reflect substantial iris pigmentation produced through ancient pathways, but they are not museum pieces preserved from one remote moment. They are modern outcomes built from inherited tools that are far older than modern humanity. The distinction is important. It allows us to say that the biological basis of brown eyes reaches deeply into the past without claiming that one exact modern shade existed everywhere 500,000 years ago. It also reminds us that evolution often works by modifying what already exists. New visible traits can emerge when regulation changes, when pigment levels shift, or when old variants enter new combinations. The foundation remains continuous even while the surface changes. In this sense, the brown eye is both ancient and new. Its pigment system belongs to a history older than our species, while its exact pattern belongs to one living person and one moment in time. Each generation renews that inheritance, carrying ancient cellular processes forward while arranging their genetic controls in combinations never perfectly repeated. The deeper secret is not that brown eyes suddenly appeared on a known date, but that their familiar color rests upon biological machinery inherited from lives that existed long before any human could remember them. Around 500,000 years ago, the human story looked very different from the world we know today. There were no cities, no agriculture, and no written language. Even our own species had either not yet appeared or was only beginning to emerge near the end of this long period, depending on which fossils and definitions are being discussed. Instead, several closely related human populations occupied different parts of Africa and Eurasia. Some groups shared common ancestors only a short time before. Others had already followed separate evolutionary paths for many generations. Their lives unfolded through repeated changes in climate, shifting grasslands, expanding forests, advancing ice sheets, and rivers that sometimes opened new routes while at other times became barriers. In this changing world, every surviving population carried inherited biological systems that had been passed through earlier members of the human family. Pigment was one of those systems. The cells responsible for producing melanin did not belong to one particular human species. They were part of the shared biological inheritance of the genus Homo, and more deeply still, of vertebrate evolution itself. Yet sharing the same biological machinery did not mean every population looked identical. As groups became separated across landscapes, genetic variation continued to accumulate. Small changes entered populations through mutation. Existing variants were reshuffled through reproduction. Population size rose and fell. Some groups disappeared entirely, while others expanded into newly favorable environments. These ordinary evolutionary processes gradually changed the combinations of inherited variants carried by different communities. The important point is that evolution rarely creates a completely new biological system when an older one can be modified instead. Eye pigmentation almost certainly followed this broader pattern. Ancient pigment pathways continued to function while their regulation and expression changed through countless generations. Because of this continuity, scientists do not search for one historical moment when brown eyes suddenly came into existence. The available evidence does not support such a simple event. Instead, researchers examine how pigment-related genes diversified within changing populations over long stretches of time. The farther back the investigation reaches, however, the more uncertain the details become. Fossils can reveal skull shape, tooth structure, body proportions, and sometimes aspects of growth or disease. They cannot directly preserve the appearance of a living iris. Soft tissues decay rapidly after death, leaving almost no direct record of eye color. Ancient DNA has transformed the study of recent prehistory, but DNA survives only under favorable conditions and becomes increasingly scarce with greater age. Specimens approaching 500,000 years old are exceptionally rare, and recoverable genetic information from that period remains limited. As a result, the biological landscape of the Middle Pleistocene is understood through a combination of fossil evidence, genetics from younger remains, comparative biology, and careful evolutionary reasoning rather than complete observation. This uncertainty is not a weakness to hide. It is part of the scientific picture itself. The history of brown eyes is therefore not a mystery because researchers know nothing. It is a mystery because some evidence survives while much of it has vanished forever. We can identify ancient pigment systems with confidence. We can trace relationships among human populations. We can recognize that inherited variation existed long before modern civilizations. Yet we cannot stand beside a river 500,000 years ago and describe every face looking back at us. Between those vanished landscapes and the present lies an immense silence, interrupted only by scattered fossils, fragments of DNA, and the biology still carried within living people. Every modern brown eye crosses that silence without fully erasing it. It reminds us that continuity does not require complete memory. The body can preserve an ancient process even after the individuals who once carried it have disappeared beyond recovery, leaving only traces from which careful science can reconstruct part, but never all, of their shared human story. When people imagine the distant past, they often picture a fossil as though it were a complete portrait frozen in stone. A skull seems capable of telling the entire story of the person who once carried it. The shape of the forehead, the size of the jaw, or the curve of the brow can feel so vivid that it is easy to forget how much has disappeared. Bone survives far more readily than skin, muscle, hair, or the delicate tissues of the eye. By the time a fossil reaches modern scientists, nearly everything that gave a living face its unique appearance has been lost. This is one of the greatest challenges in understanding the history of human eye color. The iris is a remarkably thin, soft, and living structure. It performs its work for a lifetime by adjusting the amount of light entering the eye, yet after death it begins to break down rapidly. Under ordinary conditions, it leaves no direct trace for future generations to examine. A fossilized skull may preserve the opening of the eye socket with extraordinary detail, but that opening cannot reveal whether the iris inside it was deep brown, lighter brown, hazel, grey, or another shade entirely. The colour itself disappears long before fossilization begins. This limitation shapes the way science approaches the past. Researchers do not claim to see ancient eye colours directly. Instead, they combine different kinds of evidence, each providing only part of the larger picture. Fossils describe anatomy. Ancient DNA, when it survives, may preserve some genetic variants linked to pigmentation. Comparisons with living populations help identify how those variants influence appearance today. Evolutionary biology explains how inherited traits can spread, decline, or remain stable across changing populations. None of these sources is complete by itself. Together, they allow careful reconstruction while leaving room for uncertainty where evidence is missing. Ancient DNA has made remarkable discoveries possible during the past few decades, but it also has strict limits. DNA breaks apart over time. Heat, moisture, oxygen, microorganisms, and chemical reactions gradually damage genetic material after death. Under exceptional environmental conditions, fragments may survive for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. In rare cases, much older material can be recovered. Even then, scientists usually work with incomplete sequences rather than perfectly preserved genomes. The farther back into human evolution researchers look, the fewer individuals can be studied directly. Most people who ever lived left no recoverable genetic record. Every successful DNA analysis, therefore, represents one surviving voice from a much larger population whose stories have been permanently silenced. The absence of evidence is not evidence that variation never existed. It marks the boundary between what nature preserved and what time erased. That distinction is essential when discussing brown eyes. It would be misleading to say that every early human had brown eyes simply because lighter eye colors cannot be demonstrated in older remains. It would be equally misleading to claim that lighter eyes must already have existed in every ancient population. Responsible science accepts neither conclusion. Instead, it follows the available evidence and acknowledges uncertainty whenever direct observation is impossible. This careful approach may appear less dramatic than a confident answer, yet it offers something far more valuable. It protects the difference between evidence and imagination. Every modern brown iris, therefore, reminds us of both knowledge and loss. Its biology connects us to ancient pigment systems inherited across immense stretches of evolutionary time. At the same time, it reminds us that countless individual faces have vanished beyond recovery. The bodies are gone, the soft tissues are gone, and most ancient DNA has disappeared as well. What survives allows researchers to recognize broad biological patterns, but never to restore every person who once looked across ancient landscapes. The history hidden inside brown eyes is therefore not a perfectly preserved record waiting to be read. It is a story assembled from surviving fragments, where every new discovery illuminates one small part of the past while many chapters remain forever beyond human reach. That balance between evidence and uncertainty is not a weakness of science. It is the reason the story remains trustworthy, inviting curiosity without claiming certainty where certainty no longer exists. The idea of a 500,000-year secret sounds as though it should point to a single extraordinary moment. It invites the imagination to picture one ancient person opening their eyes, revealing the first brown iris in human history. That image is memorable, but it is not how evolution usually works. Living systems rarely transform through one dramatic event that immediately reshapes an entire species. More often, change accumulates through countless generations as inherited variation is passed forward, combined in new ways, and influenced by the changing history of populations. The deeper story behind brown eyes is therefore not the birth of one color on one day. It is the long continuity of a biological system whose roots reach much farther back than written history. Pigment did not suddenly appear because humanity needed brown eyes. The cells capable of producing melanin already existed within ancient biological pathways inherited from earlier members of the human family and, beyond them, from much older vertebrate ancestors. Those pathways continued to operate while genetic variation slowly altered how much pigment appeared in particular tissues, including the iris. Across immense spans of time, different populations carried different combinations of these inherited variants. Some combinations became common within certain groups. Others remained uncommon. Many disappeared when the people who carried them left no descendants. This gradual process leaves no single birthday for brown eyes. It leaves only an expanding history of inheritance stretching across generations too numerous to count. The phrase 500,000-year secret therefore points toward the age of the biological foundations rather than the confirmed appearance of one exact modern eye color. Around that period in human evolution, several populations belonging to the genus Homo already existed. They inherited pigment systems from earlier ancestors while continuing to accumulate new genetic variation. Scientists can study fossils, compare living DNA, and analyze ancient genetic material where preservation allows. These approaches reveal continuity in the biology of pigmentation, but they do not identify the precise shade of every ancient iris. The evidence simply does not survive in that form. This is why careful researchers avoid claiming that one known population was the first to possess brown eyes exactly as they appear today. Such certainty would reach beyond the available evidence. Instead, science supports a more careful conclusion. The biological machinery underlying substantial iris pigmentation is ancient, while the exact combinations responsible for modern eye colors have continued to change through human history. That distinction may seem subtle, yet it changes the meaning of the title completely. The secret is not hidden because someone concealed it. It is hidden because evolution preserves processes more faithfully than appearances. Cells continue making melanin through mechanisms refined across immense stretches of time, While the individuals carrying those mechanisms come and go, faces disappear. Populations divide, migrate, merge, and sometimes vanish altogether. Their particular combinations of inherited variants may disappear with them, even though the underlying pigment system survives. Looking into modern brown eyes therefore resembles looking at the latest page of a book whose earliest chapters have been damaged by time. Enough remains to understand the language of the story, but not enough to recover every sentence that was once written. The familiar color becomes remarkable precisely because it survived the disappearance of countless individual lives without preserving every detail of their appearance. The body carried the process forward while history repeatedly erased its temporary expressions. This is why the oldest secret inside brown eyes is not the date when they first existed. It is the extraordinary continuity of biological inheritance itself. Across changing climates, shifting continents, expanding populations, and vanished generations, the machinery of pigmentation continued its quiet work. Every brown iris seen today is part of that unbroken continuity, even though the exact path leading to any one pair of eyes can never be reconstructed in full. The color is familiar because the process endured. The mystery remains because much of the journey disappeared long before anyone could record it. Every generation begins with an inheritance that is both ancient and new. Ancient because the biological instructions carried by parents have already passed through countless earlier lives. New because those instructions are reshuffled every time an egg and a sperm unite. No child receives a perfect copy of either parent. Instead, each receives a unique combination assembled from genetic material that has itself been recombined for thousands of generations. This quiet process has been taking place throughout human history, long before anyone understood genes, chromosomes, or DNA. It is one of the reasons why brown eyes can appear deeply familiar while never belonging to exactly the same genetic arrangement twice. The pigment system continues, but the combinations that guide it are always changing. Evolution does not keep a master design stored somewhere beyond time. It works through living populations. Every birth slightly rearranges existing variation. Every death removes one particular combination from the future, unless descendants continue to carry parts of it. Across centuries, these countless small changes accumulate into large historical patterns without requiring sudden transformation. Brown eyes therefore represent continuity without sameness. The ability to produce substantial iris pigmentation may persist across immense spans of time, while the precise collection of variants supporting that appearance gradually shifts from one generation to the next. This distinction becomes especially important when considering ancient human populations. It is tempting to imagine that if brown eyes are old, then modern brown eyes must be direct replicas of those seen hundreds of thousands of years ago. Yet biological continuity rarely works in such a literal way. A modern oak tree shares ancient developmental processes with forests that existed long before recorded history, but no living tree is identical to one that stood in a vanished landscape. The same principle applies to inherited traits within the human body. The pigment-producing system continues through time, while its visible outcomes are repeatedly renewed. Population history adds another layer to this process. Human communities have never remained completely isolated forever. Some groups expanded into new territories. Others became separated by mountains, deserts, forests, or changing coastlines. At times, neighboring populations met again after many generations apart. Whenever people formed families across those encounters, inherited variants that had followed different historical paths entered new combinations. These events did not erase older biology. They reorganized it. A variant that had been uncommon in one region might become more frequent elsewhere. Another might gradually disappear, because the people carrying it left fewer descendants. Chance alone could influence these outcomes, especially within small populations. Natural selection may also have affected some pigment-related variants under particular environmental conditions, although no single explanation accounts for every change observed across the world. The visible result is a history written through population movement rather than through isolated individuals. This helps explain why modern humanity preserves both continuity and diversity at the same time. Brown eyes remain widespread across many regions, yet they appear in countless shades and patterns. Similar colors may arise from somewhat different genetic backgrounds, while closely related families may display noticeable variation. The eye, therefore, records a history of shared ancestry without reducing humanity to one simple lineage. Behind every brown iris lies not one uninterrupted chain leading directly to a single ancient ancestor, but an intricate web connecting many generations whose lives crossed, separated, and crossed again. Looking backward, the record becomes steadily less complete. Looking forward, the process continues without pause. Every newborn receives an inheritance assembled from surviving genetic variation, not from every variation that ever existed. Countless combinations disappeared with populations that left no descendants or whose unique arrangements were gradually lost through recombination over time. What remains today is the living continuation of an ancient biological process, shaped by movement, inheritance, and chance. Brown eyes appear familiar because they belong to that enduring process, while their deepest history remains hidden within generations that carried the same biological machinery, but whose individual genetic combinations can never be completely recovered again. If there is a hidden secret inside brown eyes, it is not locked within one person. It is spread across countless generations, many of which left almost no trace behind. Every living human carries inherited DNA that has traveled through an unimaginable number of births, lives, and deaths. Yet that inheritance is incomplete. It contains only the genetic material that successfully continued into the present. Every variant that disappeared with an extinct family line, every population that left no descendants, and every unique combination that was gradually broken apart through reproduction has become part of a history that can no longer be observed directly. Brown eyes therefore survive not because they preserved everything, but because they preserved enough. Evolution is often imagined as a steady march from primitive to advanced, as though each generation replaced the previous one with something better. The real process is quieter and less predictable. Most genetic variation does not move toward perfection. It moves through populations shaped by birth, migration, isolation, environmental change, and chance. Some inherited variants become more common, others decline. Many remain at low frequencies for long periods before becoming widespread or disappearing entirely. These shifts rarely occur because one visible trait defeats another in a simple competition. Instead, they reflect the changing histories of the people carrying those traits. Brown eyes belong to this larger pattern. Their widespread presence today tells us that combinations supporting substantial iris pigmentation have remained common across many human populations. It does not tell us that every ancient population looked the same, nor that every alternative disappeared because it was less successful. Human history has never been so simple. Populations have expanded into new regions, contracted during difficult periods, and mixed with neighboring groups whenever circumstances allowed. Every one of these events altered the genetic landscape inherited by later generations. Some ancient communities vanished without leaving a direct continuation. Others became absorbed into larger populations, carrying only part of their inherited variation forward. This repeated merging and disappearance created a remarkable paradox. The biological process continued almost without interruption, while many of the individual expressions of that process were permanently lost. Modern brown eyes therefore resemble surviving branches of an immense tree whose oldest limbs have long since fallen away. The branches still living reveal that the tree endured, but they cannot fully reconstruct every path that once existed. Science approaches this lost history with humility. Researchers compare genomes from living populations, analyze ancient DNA whenever preservation makes it possible, examine fossils, and study the biology of pigment itself. These different sources reinforce one another, allowing broad conclusions about the continuity of human pigmentation. They also reveal where certainty ends. No method can recover the complete diversity of eyes that once existed across hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence simply was not preserved. This limit is not a failure of scientific investigation. It reflects the natural passage of time, which protects some traces while erasing countless others. In a sense, every brown iris carries both survival and absence. It survives because ancient biological systems continued through unbroken generations. It also carries absence because those same generations did not preserve every face, every population, or every genetic combination that contributed to the present. The color appears ordinary only because the long history behind it has become invisible. Once that history is considered, the familiar iris becomes something different. It is no longer merely a feature noticed in a mirror or a family photograph. It becomes evidence that the human body remembers through continuity rather than through perfect records. The deepest story inside brown eyes is therefore not about discovering one forgotten ancestor or identifying one exact moment in evolution. It is about recognizing that living people inherit processes older than memory itself, while accepting that much of the journey leading to those processes has disappeared beyond recovery. The secret survives because biology continued. The details remain hidden because time never promised to preserve them. Imagine two groups of early humans living under very different skies. One spends countless generations beneath intense sunlight near the equator. Another gradually settles in regions where the light changes dramatically with the seasons, where long winters and shorter days become familiar parts of life. Although both groups belong to the same species and share the same fundamental biology, the environments surrounding them are no longer identical. Climate, landscape, food availability, and patterns of movement begin shaping their history in different ways. These differences do not rewrite the human body from the beginning. Instead, they influence populations already carrying a rich collection of inherited genetic variation. This is the setting in which scientists consider how environment may have contributed to the distribution of visible traits, including eye color. It is important to begin with restraint. There is no single accepted explanation for why different eye colors occur at different frequencies around the world. Human evolution rarely follows one simple cause. Researchers continue to study how natural selection, genetic drift, founder effects, migration, and patterns of reproduction may each have influenced pigmentation over thousands of generations. Their relative importance almost certainly varied across different regions and historical periods. Because these processes often operated together, no single factor can explain every modern population. Brown eyes, therefore, should not be understood as the inevitable product of one climate or one environment alone. Even so, the relationship between light and biology is impossible to ignore. Sunlight has influenced many aspects of human evolution. The body responds to light through vision, daily biological rhythms, hormone regulation, and the production of vitamin D in the skin. Pigment also interacts with light, although its role differs depending on the tissue involved. In the eye, melanin contributes to the regulation of incoming light, helping absorb excess light within the iris and supporting the normal function of ocular structures. The pigment found in the iris belongs to a wider biological system that has long been part of vertebrate evolution. Human populations inherited that system before spreading across diverse environments. As people gradually occupied new landscapes, the combinations of pigment-related genetic variants they carried also changed through ordinary inheritance. Some variants became more common in particular populations. Others became less frequent or disappeared. These changes may have reflected a mixture of environmental influences and demographic history rather than one universal evolutionary rule. This distinction is essential because visible geography can tempt people toward overly simple conclusions. It is true that certain eye colors are more common in some regions than in others, yet those regional patterns develop through long histories of migration, isolation, population expansion, and repeated contact between neighboring groups. Climate formed only one part of a much larger story. A modern population reflects thousands of years of movement and mixing, not a single moment of adaptation. Looking back toward human origins makes this even clearer. The earliest members of our species emerged within African populations that already possess substantial genetic diversity. As small groups gradually moved into new territories over many generations, they carried only part of that diversity with them. Later migrations introduced additional variation, while isolated communities sometimes developed different frequencies of inherited traits through chance alone. The visible world of modern eye color therefore cannot be read as a simple environmental map. It is a historical map as well, shaped by the journeys of populations whose descendants continued while others disappeared. Brown eyes remain deeply connected to this shared beginning. Their widespread presence across much of humanity reflects continuity within ancient pigment systems, rather than proof of one universal environmental advantage. Every modern iris records both biology and history at once. The amount of melanin within its tissues tells only part of the story. The rest lies in the movement of people across continents, the survival of families through changing climates, and the countless generations that quietly carried inherited variation from one world into the next without ever knowing the remarkable history hidden inside their own familiar eyes. When people think about pigment, they often imagine that the body follows one simple rule. Dark skin, dark hair, and brown eyes seem as though they should always appear together, while lighter skin, lighter hair, and blue eyes seem equally connected. At first glance, this expectation feels reasonable because all three features involve melanin, yet the human body is organized in a far more intricate way. Pigment is produced through related biological pathways, but each tissue regulates that pigment according to its own developmental program. The skin, the hair, and the iris all depend on melanin, yet they do not respond to inherited variation in exactly the same manner. This is why people with similar skin tones can have different eye colors, and why similar eye colors can appear across a wide range of skin and hair combinations. The shared pigment system creates connections without requiring identical outcomes. During early development, specialized pigment cells arise from embryonic tissues that later travel to different parts of the body. As these cells settle into the skin, hair follicles, and eyes, they begin working within environments that are biologically distinct. The genes influencing pigment production continue to operate, but they do so under different regulatory conditions depending on the tissue involved. As a result, a genetic variant that noticeably affects pigmentation in one part of the body may have a smaller effect in another. Likewise, combinations of variants can produce similar visible eye colors while differing in their influence on skin or hair. This layered regulation helps explain why appearance cannot be reduced to one simple genetic formula. The iris deserves particular attention because its purpose extends far beyond displaying color. It is part of the optical system that regulates incoming light. Melanin within the iris contributes to that function, while also creating the appearance recognized as brown, hazel, green, gray, or blue. The same pigment therefore serves both biological and visual roles. It exists because the eye requires healthy functioning, not because humans evolved to create a particular aesthetic pattern. Color is the visible consequence of deeper physiological processes already taking place inside living tissue. This perspective also changes how we think about human evolution. Early members of our species did not evolve separate bodies for separate environments. They inherited one flexible biological framework capable of producing variation across many generations. As populations expanded into different landscapes, existing genetic diversity interacted with demographic history and environmental pressures in complex ways. Some inherited combinations became more common within certain groups. Others remained rare or gradually declined. None of these changes transformed pigment into isolated systems working independently. The same ancient biological machinery continued operating throughout the body while different tissues responded according to their own developmental needs. Looking toward the beginning of humanity reminds us that these relationships have deep roots. The earliest populations already carried genetic diversity affecting many visible traits. As generations passed, migration, isolation, and recombination constantly rearranged that diversity. The modern combinations seen today represent only those that survived into the present. Countless alternatives disappeared as lineages ended or populations merged. A brown iris, therefore, cannot be understood without considering the larger biological network supporting it. It belongs to the eye, yet it also belongs to a body whose pigment systems have evolved together while remaining partly independent. This is why no single visible feature can fully describe a person's ancestry or evolutionary history. The eye tells one chapter, the skin tells another, hair adds another layer still. Together they reveal continuity across the human species, while preserving remarkable diversity within it. Brown eyes remain one expression of that shared inheritance, not because the body follows a single pigment rule, but because ancient biological processes continue to operate through tissues that have learned to solve different tasks in different ways across immense stretches of human history. The familiar color seen in the mirror is therefore less a solitary trait than one visible note within a much older biological harmony that began long before modern humanity and continues quietly with every new generation. The longer scientists study human evolution, the more they discover that simple answers rarely survive careful examination. It is natural to ask why brown eyes became so widespread across much of the world. If one visible trait appears more frequently than another, the mind immediately searches for a single cause. Perhaps it offered a powerful advantage. Perhaps it replaced every competing form. Perhaps nature selected it again and again, until it became the ordinary face of humanity. These ideas are understandable, but the evidence points toward a quieter and more complicated history. Evolution usually works through several processes acting at the same time, sometimes supporting one another, sometimes pulling in different directions. Brown eyes are best understood within that larger picture, rather than through one universal explanation. Natural selection is certainly part of the story. When inherited traits influence survival or reproductive success under particular conditions, the genetic variants associated with those traits may gradually become more common. Yet eye color occupies an unusual position because it is closely connected to a pigment system that serves important biological functions while also creating visible differences between people. The pigment within the iris helps regulate the passage of light through the eye, but the exact amount of visible pigment can also be influenced by inherited variation that may have different consequences in different environments. Scientists continue to investigate these relationships, yet no single explanation has gained universal acceptance for the worldwide distribution of human eye colors. Another process is far less dramatic but equally important. Genetic drift changes populations through chance rather than advantage. In every generation, some inherited variants become slightly more common, while others become slightly less common, simply because of which individuals have children. These small changes are often insignificant within very large populations, but they can become much more noticeable when communities remain small or isolated for many generations. Over long periods of time, ordinary chance can reshape the frequencies of visible traits without requiring those traits to provide any special benefit. Human history contains many opportunities for this process. Groups separated by mountains, rivers, deserts, or changing climates sometimes remained apart for thousands of years. During those intervals, inherited variation continued to shift quietly through reproduction alone. Founder effects add still another layer to the picture. When a relatively small number of people establish a new community, they carry only part of the genetic diversity found in the larger population from which they came. Future generations inherit that limited sample. As the community grows, some inherited variants become common simply because they happen to be present among the founders, while others remain rare or disappear altogether. This process has been observed repeatedly in population genetics and helps explain why neighboring populations may differ even without strong environmental differences. Looking back toward the beginning of our species makes these processes even more meaningful. Early human populations did not spread across the world as one enormous group. They expanded gradually through many small communities, each carrying only part of the diversity that already existed. Some groups survived difficult climates, others disappeared. Some later reunited with neighboring populations, bringing together genetic variants that had followed separate histories for many generations. Every migration, separation, and reunion subtly reshaped the inheritance carried into the future. Brown eyes became part of that continuing story, not because one force alone determined their fate, but because many forces acted together across immense spans of time. The familiar color seen today is therefore not evidence of one simple evolutionary victory. It reflects continuity, movement, inheritance, and chance woven together across hundreds of thousands of years. A brown iris reminds us that the human body rarely preserves history in straight lines. Instead, it carries overlapping traces of ancient biological systems, changing populations, and countless family histories whose individual paths have mostly vanished, even while their shared inheritance continues quietly in the eyes of people living today. By this point, brown eyes no longer appear to be a simple physical feature. They have become a record of ancient biological processes, population history, and the quiet persistence of inherited variation. Yet another question naturally follows. If brown eyes are so widespread today, what happened to the other colors? It is tempting to imagine that lighter eyes slowly emerged as brown eyes faded away in certain regions, almost like one paint replacing another on a canvas. Human evolution, however, leaves a more intricate pattern. New variations do not erase the older biological system. They arise within it, spread through populations under particular historical circumstances, and continue alongside older forms rather than replacing them completely. Understanding lighter eyes, therefore, begins with understanding that brown eyes never disappeared. They remained part of the shared inheritance carried across nearly every chapter of human history. The appearance of lighter eye colors is generally understood as a more recent development within our species than the ancient pigment systems responsible for substantial melanin in the iris. Genetic research has identified variants associated with reduced iris pigmentation that are especially common in parts of Europe today. These findings suggest that some of the genetic changes contributing to blue eyes originated after modern humans had already emerged. This does not mean scientists know the exact moment when the first blue-eyed individual lived, nor does it mean one mutation alone created every light eye seen today. Eye color remains a polygenic trait influenced by multiple interacting genes. Even so, certain genetic variants appear to have played especially important roles in reducing melanin within the iris, while leaving the basic pigment-producing machinery intact. The emergence of these variants illustrates an important principle of evolution. Biological systems are often modified rather than replaced. The human body did not invent a completely new mechanism for producing blue eyes. Instead, inherited changes affected how much pigment accumulated in the front layers of the iris. With less melanin present, incoming light interacted differently with the microscopic structure of the tissue, producing the familiar appearance of blue. The underlying biology remained deeply connected to the same ancient pigment pathways carried by people with brown eyes. This is why all human eye colors belong to one continuous evolutionary story rather than separate biological origins. Looking back toward the earliest populations of Homo sapiens helps place these developments into perspective. The first members of our species inherited pigment systems that had already existed for immense stretches of evolutionary time. As generations passed, genetic variation continued to accumulate naturally. Most new variants remained rare or disappeared. A few persisted because they were carried forward through surviving lineages. Later demographic events, including migration, population growth, and periods of relative isolation, influenced how frequently particular variants appeared in different regions. This combination of mutation and population history helps explain why lighter eyes are concentrated more strongly in some parts of the world than in others without requiring a separate origin for the people themselves. Brown eyes and lighter eyes, therefore, should never be viewed as signs of different kinds of humanity. They represent different outcomes produced by the same shared biological framework. Every living person inherits the ancient cellular machinery responsible for producing pigment. What differs is the particular combination of genetic variants influencing how that machinery operates within the iris. The visible contrast between brown and blue may seem striking, but beneath the surface, the biological similarities are far greater than the differences. Seen through this longer perspective, lighter eyes become another chapter in the continuing history of inherited variation rather than an exception to it. Brown eyes did not give way to blue eyes as one civilization replaces another. Instead, ancient pigment systems continued while new genetic combinations gradually entered the human story. Both colors now exist because generations of people carried different versions of the same enduring biological inheritance across changing landscapes, changing climates, and changing histories, leaving the remarkable diversity of human eyes visible today without ever breaking the continuity that connects every population to its deepest evolutionary beginnings. The emergence of lighter eye colors has often been described as though it marked a sharp turning point in human evolution. In reality, evolutionary change usually unfolds with far less certainty. A genetic variant may first appear in one individual, but that moment alone does not transform a population. Most new mutations disappear within only a few generations because the people carrying them leave no lasting descendants. Only a small fraction remain in the population long enough to become part of its continuing history. This simple fact reminds us that the appearance of a genetic variant and its eventual distribution are two very different events. Between them lies an unpredictable journey shaped by inheritance, population size, migration, and chance. Research on human eye color suggests that some genetic variants associated with reduced iris pigmentation became increasingly common after modern humans had already spread into parts of Eurasia. Ancient DNA recovered from later prehistoric individuals has allowed scientists to compare pigment-related variants across different periods, revealing that the frequencies observed today developed gradually rather than appearing all at once. These findings provide valuable clues, but they do not tell the complete story. Ancient DNA survives only under favorable conditions, and every recovered genome represents one individual rather than an entire population. Large stretches of human history remain invisible because the genetic evidence was never preserved. Even so, the surviving record consistently points toward gradual change instead of sudden replacement. This gradual pattern reflects the nature of inheritance itself. Every generation receives a mixture of existing genetic variation. New combinations emerge continually as chromosomes are reshuffled during reproduction. When populations remain connected through migration and family relationships, inherited variants spread slowly across expanding networks of descendants. When populations become separated, different combinations may become common in different places. Thousands of years later, renewed contact between those groups creates still more opportunities for inherited variation to mix. Eye color followed this broader pattern of human movement rather than existing outside it. The story of lighter eyes is therefore also a story about the movement of people across landscapes shaped by changing climates and shifting environments. None of these processes erase the ancient biological foundations already discussed. The pigment-producing machinery remained remarkably stable, while the regulation of pigment continued to vary. Brown eyes persisted throughout this history because the underlying pathways responsible for substantial melanin in the iris remained widespread across human populations. Lighter eyes appeared through changes affecting those pathways, not through the creation of an entirely separate system. This continuity explains why all modern eye colors belong to one connected evolutionary framework despite their obvious visual differences. Looking back toward the origins of our species reinforces another important point. Human diversity has never developed as a sequence of isolated inventions. Instead, variation accumulated within populations that shared common ancestry while repeatedly exchanging inherited genetic material. Every visible trait carried into the present has traveled through this network of relationships. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, and intermediate shades all represent different expressions of biological possibilities preserved within one species. None stands outside the larger history connecting every human population. The contrast that seems so striking in everyday life becomes much smaller when viewed across evolutionary time. Beneath the visible color lies a shared anatomy, shared developmental pathways, and shared pigment cells inherited from ancestors who lived long before any of today's eye colors reached their modern frequencies. The familiar distinction between brown and blue therefore reflects differences in regulation rather than differences in fundamental biological design. This perspective transforms the way the eyes are understood. Instead of symbols separating people into distinct groups, they become reminders of a common inheritance continually reshaped through migration, reproduction, and time. Every iris carries evidence that evolution works by modifying existing systems, preserving ancient foundations while allowing new variations to emerge, spread, and coexist across generations whose individual stories have mostly disappeared, even though the living record of their shared ancestry still looks quietly back at us every day. After following the long history of pigment through genes, populations, and migration, it becomes possible to see eye color from a different perspective. The contrast between brown and lighter eyes seems striking because the human brain naturally notices visible differences. Yet, evolution often pays less attention to those differences than people do. Beneath every iris lies the same fundamental anatomy. The cornea bends incoming light. The pupil changes size as conditions become brighter or darker. The lens helps focus images. The retina converts light into signals that travel toward the brain. These structures operate according to biological principles shared by every healthy human eye, regardless of its color. The iris contributes to this system by regulating the amount of light entering the eye, and melanin within its tissues supports that function. The visible color is therefore one characteristic of a much larger biological design rather than the defining purpose of the organ itself. This perspective helps explain why scientists are cautious when discussing the evolution of eye color. A visible difference does not automatically imply a profound biological divide. Two people with different eye colors usually share far more genetic similarity than their appearance suggests. The overwhelming majority of their DNA is identical in function, carrying instructions required for building and maintaining the human body. Only a relatively small number of inherited differences contribute to traits such as eye color, hair color, or aspects of skin pigmentation. Those differences are real, but they exist within an extraordinary foundation of shared biology inherited from common ancestors. Looking back toward the beginning of our species makes this continuity even more striking. Every population that has ever lived descended from earlier populations, carrying forward ancient biological systems while also introducing new combinations through reproduction. No generation began from nothing. Every child inherited genetic material already shaped by countless previous lives. Some inherited variants disappeared because family lines ended. Others survived through descendants who continued carrying them into new environments and new historical periods. Brown eyes and lighter eyes alike are products of this uninterrupted chain of inheritance. Neither stands outside the story of humanity. Both exist because the same biological framework remained flexible enough to preserve old functions while accommodating new variation. The modern world sometimes encourages people to think of visible traits as markers of deep separation. Evolution tells a different story. Human populations have repeatedly divided, migrated, reunited, and exchanged genetic variation throughout history. Boundaries that appear permanent on maps today were often temporary in the longer history of our species. The genes influencing eye color moved with people across continents, through families, and across generations that never imagined how their descendants would one day study the biology of the iris. This long movement blurred simple categories while preserving remarkable diversity. It also ensured that no modern eye color belongs exclusively to one isolated human story. Every color has been shaped by shared ancestry, interacting with local population history over immense stretches of time. Returning to the question posed at the beginning of this journey, the hidden secret inside brown eyes no longer appears to be one forgotten event buried 500,000 years ago. Instead, the secret is continuity itself. The biological machinery producing pigment has endured through changing climates, expanding populations, vanished lineages, and repeated migrations without ever remaining completely unchanged. Every brown iris seen today carries that ancient continuity forward, while every lighter iris demonstrates how inherited variation can emerge within the same enduring system. Together, they reveal that evolution rarely replaces the old with the entirely new. More often, it preserves what already works, quietly adjusting it generation after generation. Seen in this light, the eye becomes more than a visible feature. It becomes a living reminder that the deepest history of humanity is written not only in fossils or ancient DNA, but also in ordinary biological processes still unfolding within every person who opens their eyes to the world today. For most of human history, the question of ancient eye color could never be answered directly. Bones survived, stone tools survived. Sometimes traces of fire, pollen, or animal remains survived as well. Yet the soft tissues that gave a living face its appearance disappeared long before anyone could study them. Archaeologists could uncover the outline of a skull, estimate a person's age, identify injuries that had healed during life, and even reconstruct aspects of diet or movement. The eyes themselves, however, were almost always lost. For generations, the color of those vanished irises remained beyond scientific reach. The situation began to change only with the development of ancient DNA research. Instead of asking whether preserved eyes could be found, scientists learned to search for fragments of genetic material that had survived inside bones and teeth. These fragments were often incomplete and heavily damaged, but under favorable conditions they still contained valuable biological information. Recovering ancient DNA did not allow researchers to see an individual's eyes directly. What it offered instead was something more subtle. Certain inherited genetic variants associated with pigmentation could sometimes be identified, allowing cautious estimates about the likely appearance of particular individuals. This represented an extraordinary advance, but it also introduced new responsibilities. A genetic estimate is not the same as a photograph. Even when pigment-related variants are preserved, eye color remains a trait influenced by multiple genes rather than one genetic location alone. Researchers therefore describe probabilities instead of certainties whenever possible. This careful language reflects the limits of the evidence rather than any weakness in the science. Ancient DNA has transformed our understanding of population history because it allows living people to be compared with individuals who died thousands of years ago. By examining inherited variation across different periods, scientists can observe how genetic patterns changed as populations expanded, mixed, or disappeared. These discoveries have shown that the distribution of pigment-related variants has never been static. Frequencies shifted gradually through time as communities moved across landscapes and exchanged ancestry with neighboring groups. Eye color, therefore, became one small part of a much larger historical process visible within ancient genomes. At the same time, every ancient DNA sample reminds researchers how incomplete the surviving record remains. Most human beings who ever lived left no recoverable genetic material. DNA survives only under exceptional circumstances, and even then only a tiny fraction of individuals are preserved well enough to study. The people whose genomes have been recovered represent valuable evidence, but they cannot stand for every community that once existed. Countless families, villages, and entire populations disappeared without leaving readable genetic records behind. Their contribution to human history must often be inferred indirectly through archaeology, comparative genetics, and the descendants who survived. This balance between discovery and uncertainty is one of the defining strengths of modern evolutionary research. New evidence can refine earlier ideas without pretending that every question has already been answered. Brown eyes remain central to this story because they connect ancient biological continuity with modern genetic investigation. The widespread pigment systems inherited across humanity can now be studied in ways that earlier generations of scientists could scarcely imagine. Even so, every new genome recovered from the past reveals only one additional fragment of a much larger picture. The deepest history of human eyes still lies partly beyond recovery, preserved not in complete records but in scattered pieces assembled through careful scientific work. Each discovery narrows the gap between the ancient world and the present, yet it also reminds us how much has been permanently lost. The familiar brown iris seen today therefore represents both evidence and mystery, linking living people to ancestors whose appearance can sometimes be estimated, but whose complete faces will never be fully restored from the fragments that time has allowed to survive. Once ancient DNA began revealing fragments of the human past, a new possibility emerged. Scientists were no longer limited to comparing living populations with one another. They could begin comparing people who lived thousands of years apart, asking not only where populations moved but also how inherited traits changed through time. This shift transformed the study of human history. Instead of relying entirely on modern genetic patterns, researchers could observe snapshots taken at different moments in prehistory. Each ancient genome became a point on a much longer timeline, allowing broad patterns to emerge gradually rather than being inferred only from the present. Yet every ancient genome also carried an important reminder. It represented one individual, not an entire civilization. A burial site might preserve the remains of only a handful of people, while countless others from the same period left no recoverable DNA at all. For this reason, scientists avoid treating a single ancient individual as the complete biological picture of a whole population. Even when several individuals from one archaeological site can be studied, they still represent only a fraction of the people who once lived there. The strength of ancient DNA lies not in providing perfect certainty, but in allowing many independent discoveries to be compared across different places and different periods. When those discoveries begin pointing in the same direction, confidence grows. When they differ, new questions emerge. This careful process has revealed that the distribution of pigment-related genetic variants has changed repeatedly throughout human history. Some variants associated with lighter iris pigmentation appear infrequently in older genomes and become more common in later populations from particular regions. Other pigment-related variants remain widespread across many ancient and modern populations, reflecting the deep continuity of the biological systems responsible for melanin production. These observations do not describe a single evolutionary event. They reveal a long sequence of demographic changes unfolding across thousands of years as populations expanded, interacted, and exchanged ancestry. Archaeology provides the essential context for interpreting these discoveries. Ancient DNA alone cannot explain why populations moved or how they lived. Excavated settlements, stone tools, animal remains, plant evidence, burial practices, and environmental records help reconstruct the worlds in which those people existed. Together, archaeology and genetics create a far richer understanding than either discipline could achieve independently. A genome may reveal biological relationships, while an archaeological site reveals the daily realities surrounding those relationships. One describes inheritance, the other describes the lives through which that inheritance continued. Looking toward the beginning of our species, this partnership becomes even more valuable. The farther back researchers travel in time, the fewer complete genetic records survive. Fossils become more common than genomes, and environmental evidence often tells more than DNA alone. Scientists therefore combine every available source of information while remaining careful not to draw conclusions that exceed the evidence. This balance between confidence and restraint is one of the defining features of modern paleoanthropology. Brown eyes remain an important thread within this broader investigation because they connect visible human diversity with deep evolutionary continuity. Every ancient genome carrying pigment-related variants contributes another small piece to the larger puzzle, but none provides the final picture. The history hidden inside modern eyes is reconstructed gradually through hundreds of discoveries rather than revealed by one extraordinary specimen. That is why scientific understanding continues to evolve as new evidence is uncovered. Each excavation, each improved laboratory technique, and each newly recovered genome has the potential to refine earlier interpretations without overturning the fundamental conclusion already supported by many lines of evidence. Human eye color has always belonged to a living population, not to isolated individuals. The story preserved within brown eyes is therefore written across generations, archaeological landscapes, and fragments of ancient DNA that, when viewed together, illuminate the remarkable continuity of humanity, while honestly acknowledging the many pages that time has permanently removed from the historical record. As the evidence from archaeology and ancient DNA gradually accumulates, a quiet pattern becomes visible. The greatest discoveries rarely come from a single remarkable skeleton or one exceptionally well-preserved genome. Instead, understanding grows because many small pieces of evidence begin supporting one another. A fragment of DNA recovered from a tooth, the age of a burial determined through careful dating, the tools left beside a grave, the pollen preserved within surrounding soil, and the comparison with other ancient populations all contribute different kinds of information. None of these discoveries can answer every question alone. Together, however, they allow researchers to reconstruct parts of a human past that once seemed permanently inaccessible. This method is especially important when studying visible traits such as eye color. Modern people often expect science to identify the exact appearance of someone who lived thousands of years ago. The available evidence rarely allows such certainty. Even when an ancient genome is exceptionally well preserved, it cannot reproduce a complete face. Eye color predictions remain probabilistic because multiple genetic variants contribute to pigmentation, and some influences are still not completely understood. Environmental damage may also remove portions of ancient DNA before researchers ever recover it. A missing genetic region cannot simply be imagined or replaced. Scientists must work only with the evidence that survives. This careful restraint protects the reliability of every conclusion. The same principle applies when interpreting broader patterns across ancient populations. If several individuals from one region appear likely to have carried similar pigment-related variants, this does not automatically mean every person living there shared the same appearance. Human populations have always contained variation. Some individuals carried inherited combinations that were common, while others possessed combinations that were much less frequent. Every community therefore included biological diversity, even when certain visible traits appeared more often than others. Recognizing this diversity prevents modern observers from turning probability into certainty or population averages into descriptions of every individual. Looking back toward the earliest chapters of humanity reinforces that lesson. Ancient populations were not frozen in time, They change from one generation to the next through births, deaths, migration, and the continual reshuffling of inherited genetic variation. The evidence recovered today represents only a tiny sample of those countless lives. Each newly analyzed genome expands knowledge, but it also reminds researchers how much has disappeared forever. The scientific picture, therefore, becomes clearer without ever becoming complete. Brown eyes occupy a remarkable place within this growing body of evidence. Their biological foundations extend deep into the evolutionary history of our species and beyond, while their modern distribution reflects thousands of generations of population history. Ancient DNA has helped illuminate parts of that journey, but it has not transformed uncertainty into absolute certainty. Instead, it has shown that careful scientific investigation can reveal extraordinary insights while remaining honest about its limits. This balance between discovery and restraint is one of the strongest reasons why modern evolutionary research continues to earn confidence. Every conclusion remains open to refinement if new evidence appears, yet each conclusion is also anchored in observations that can be tested, compared, and evaluated by other researchers. The history hidden within brown eyes is therefore not a legend waiting to be uncovered by one dramatic discovery. It is a mosaic assembled patiently from evidence gathered across many disciplines and many decades of research. Every fossil, every archaeological excavation, every recovered genome, and every improved analytical method contributes another small piece to that mosaic. The complete picture may never be finished, but the pattern already visible is remarkable enough. It reveals that an ordinary brown iris carries traces of evolutionary continuity reaching far beyond recorded history, while also reminding us that the most trustworthy understanding of the past is built not from certainty alone, but from evidence carefully gathered, carefully questioned, and carefully connected across generations of scientific discovery. By now, the journey through human history has revealed something unexpected. The most familiar eye color on Earth owes its existence not to a single moment of evolutionary triumph, but to an ancient biological system carried quietly through countless generations. Yet this understanding raises another question that reaches beyond genetics alone. If brown eyes are so deeply rooted in our evolutionary past, why have human societies attached so many different meanings to them? Biology explains how eye color develops. History reveals how people interpreted it. These are not the same story, and keeping them separate is essential. Throughout recorded history, people have often assigned symbolic meanings to physical appearance. Hair, skin, height, facial features, and eye color have all attracted cultural beliefs that reflected local traditions rather than biological reality. Brown eyes, because they have been the most common eye color across much of the world, naturally became part of countless stories, poems, religious imagery, and family traditions. In some cultures, they were associated with warmth or familiarity. In others, they attracted little attention precisely because they were so common. Meanwhile, rarer eye colors sometimes acquired an unusual reputation simply because they stood out visually within particular communities. These cultural interpretations changed repeatedly across time and place. None of them altered the underlying biology of the iris itself. Separating culture from biology becomes especially important when looking at the past. Modern ideas about appearance can easily be projected backward onto ancient populations, creating narratives unsupported by evidence. It is tempting to imagine that prehistoric people valued eye colors in the same ways that some societies have done in more recent centuries. There is no reliable evidence allowing such conclusions. The archaeological record preserves tools, settlements, food remains, and occasionally artistic expression, but it rarely reveals how ancient communities perceived ordinary physical traits among themselves. Assigning modern preferences to people who lived tens of thousands of years ago would go beyond what current evidence can support. The safest conclusion is also the simplest. Human beings have always possessed visible variation, while the meanings attached to that variation have changed with culture rather than with biology. This distinction helps explain why the same eye color may carry different symbolic associations in different parts of the world. Cultural meanings emerge from language, literature, religion, art, and shared social experience. They are learned rather than inherited. Biological inheritance determines how much melanin develops within the iris. Culture determines the stories people later tell about that appearance. The two processes influence human life in different ways and should never be confused. Looking back toward the origins of our species reminds us how recent these cultural layers truly are. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, there were no written descriptions of eye color, no portraits preserving exact appearances, and no historical documents recording aesthetic preferences. Long before civilizations emerged, people already carried the biological diversity that would later become the subject of myths, traditions, and artistic expression. The eyes themselves came first. Their symbolic meanings followed much later. This perspective restores a sense of proportion. Brown eyes are not widespread because history celebrated them, nor are lighter eyes uncommon because history rejected them. The distribution of eye color developed through evolutionary and demographic processes extending across immense spans of time. Human cultures then interpreted that biological diversity according to their own beliefs, values, and experiences. Those interpretations deserve study because they reveal how societies understand themselves, but they should not be mistaken for explanations of human evolution. The familiar brown iris, therefore, carries two histories at once. One is biological, reaching back through ancient pigment systems inherited across countless generations. The other is cultural, created by people who looked into one another's eyes and gave ordinary physical differences and meanings that reflected their own worlds. The first history belongs to evolution, the second belongs to civilization. Together they remind us that understanding humanity requires recognizing where biology ends, where culture begins, and how easily the two can become intertwined in the stories people tell about themselves across time. Once civilizations began leaving written records, eye color gradually entered history in a new way. It no longer existed only as a biological characteristic passed from parents to children. It also became part of language. Poets described eyes to express emotion. Storytellers used them to distinguish memorable characters. Artists painted them according to local traditions and available pigments. Historians occasionally mention them when describing rulers, travelers, or unfamiliar peoples. None of these descriptions was intended to explain human evolution. Instead, they reveal how different societies noticed and interpreted visible human diversity through the cultural lenses of their own time. Reading these historical sources requires careful attention. Ancient writers rarely described appearance with the precision expected in modern scientific observation. Words translated today as brown, dark, bright, or light often carried broader meanings in their original languages. Some emphasized the way sunlight reflected from the eye rather than its precise pigmentation. Others blended observations of hair, skin, clothing, and social identity into a single description of appearance. A term that appears straightforward in translation may therefore have represented a much more flexible idea in its historical context. This is one reason historians avoid treating literary descriptions as direct biological evidence. A poem can reveal how people imagined beauty without revealing the frequency of a particular eye color within the population. A chronicle may describe one remarkable individual while remaining silent about everyone else. Artistic representations introduce another layer of complexity. Portraits often reflected cultural conventions as much as physical reality. In many periods, artists worked within established traditions that emphasized symbolic meaning over exact anatomical accuracy. Religious paintings, royal portraits, and heroic figures were frequently shaped by artistic expectations rather than by careful biological observation. Even highly realistic paintings cannot always be assumed to preserve natural eye color faithfully. Pigments available to artists changed over time. Restoration altered many works centuries later, and some portraits were created long after the subject had died. Art, therefore, provides valuable cultural evidence while remaining an uncertain guide to ancient pigmentation. Looking toward archaeology reinforces this distinction. Excavated settlements reveal how people lived, what they ate, which animals they hunted or raised, how they built homes, and how communities changed through time. These discoveries provide direct evidence of daily life. Written descriptions and artistic images reveal something different. They show how people understood themselves and the world around them. Together, these sources enrich historical understanding, but neither replaces biological evidence when questions concern the evolution of eye color. Brown eyes illustrate this relationship particularly well because they have been so widespread across many populations for such a long period. Their very familiarity often meant they received less attention than rarer appearances that stood out within local communities. Historical silence, therefore, should not be interpreted as biological absence. An ordinary feature frequently becomes invisible within everyday language precisely because it is expected. Returning to the deeper human story helps place these written records into perspective. For hundreds of thousands of years before the first surviving texts, eye color already existed as part of ordinary human variation. Families inherited pigment-related genetic variants without recording them in writing. Children resembled parents without understanding chromosomes or DNA. The biological story unfolded continuously, while cultural history had not yet begun to document it. Once writing appeared, it added another layer to humanity's memory without replacing the far older record preserved within living bodies. Every brown iris, therefore, belongs to two timelines at once. One stretches through evolutionary history, where inheritance operates silently across generations. The other belongs to civilization, where people gradually transformed ordinary physical traits into language, symbolism, literature, and art. Understanding both histories requires recognizing the different questions they answer. Biology explains how the trait is inherited. Historical documents explain how people interpreted what they saw. When those two forms of evidence are kept distinct, they complement one another rather than compete, allowing the familiar brown eye to be understood both as an ancient biological inheritance and as a recurring presence within the written memory of human civilization. As history moved forward, ideas about appearance continued to change while the biology beneath those appearances remained remarkably consistent. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. Religions spread across continents. Trade connected distant cultures that had once known little about one another. Through every period, people continued noticing differences in faces, including the color of the eyes. Those observations sometimes inspired admiration, sometimes curiosity, and sometimes misunderstanding. Yet none of these changing opinions altered the genetic processes through which eye color was inherited. The body continued passing pigment-related variants from one generation to the next, regardless of the stories societies attached to them. This distinction became especially important during the last few centuries, when attempts were sometimes made to classify human populations according to visible physical traits. Eye color was occasionally included alongside other external characteristics in systems that sought to divide humanity into rigid categories. Modern genetics has shown why such approaches are fundamentally incomplete. Human biological variation does not organize itself into clear, separate groups defined by a handful of visible features. Instead, inherited variation is distributed gradually across populations that have repeatedly exchanged ancestry throughout history. A brown iris cannot identify a person's intelligence, character, culture, or worth. It cannot reveal the language spoken by distant ancestors or determine the civilization to which a family once belonged. Eye color records only one small aspect of biological inheritance. The deeper history carried within human DNA is vastly more complex than any visible feature alone can express. Scientific research over the past several decades has strengthened this understanding. Studies of human genomes consistently show that most genetic variation is shared across all living populations. The inherited differences responsible for visible traits such as eye color represent only a tiny fraction of the human genome. Those differences help explain why people look different from one another, but they do not divide humanity into separate biological kinds. Instead, they illustrate how small changes accumulated within one interconnected species as populations expanded, migrated, and met again across thousands of generations. Looking back toward the earliest members of Homo sapiens makes this conclusion even more meaningful. Every living person descends from populations that shared common ancestors in the distant past. As groups gradually spread across Africa and later into other regions, inherited variation accompanied them. Some pigment-related variants became more frequent in particular populations through ordinary evolutionary and demographic processes. Others remained widespread across much of humanity. None of these patterns created separate human origins. They reflected different paths taken by branches of the same evolutionary tree. Brown eyes, therefore, belong to a story of connection rather than separation. Their remarkable continuity across many populations reflects the persistence of ancient biological systems shared by all humans. The visible differences that later emerged, including lighter eye colors, developed within that same inherited framework rather than replacing it. This perspective changes the meaning of ordinary appearance. A brown iris is no longer simply a familiar feature seen in a mirror or across a crowded room. It becomes evidence that countless generations carried ancient biological processes forward while continually exchanging genetic variation with neighboring populations. The eye quietly preserves continuity even when history appears filled with division. Civilizations may have drawn borders, developed different languages, and created distinct traditions, but inheritance continued crossing those boundaries whenever people formed families together. The result is the extraordinary biological unity visible beneath human diversity today. Brown eyes remind us that the longest story in human history is not one of separation, but of shared ancestry unfolding across immense stretches of time. The meanings attached to eye color have changed from one culture to another, yet the underlying biology has continued its patient work without regard for those interpretations. In that sense, the familiar brown iris offers one final lesson before the journey turns toward its conclusion. It shows that the deepest truths about humanity are often quieter than the stories people tell. They are written not in myths about appearance, but in the enduring continuity of life itself, carried gently from one generation to the next, across the unbroken history of our species. As the journey approaches its final chapters, the question that opened this story begins to look different. At first, it seemed to ask about one familiar physical trait. Why are brown eyes so common, and what hidden secret could they possibly contain? After traveling through genetics, archaeology, ancient DNA, and the long movement of human populations, the answer no longer rests in the color itself. The deeper mystery lies in the remarkable continuity that the color represents. A brown iris is visible for only a lifetime, yet the biological processes that make it possible have endured across spans of time far beyond any individual memory. This contrast between a brief human life and an ancient evolutionary inheritance is one of the quietest and most profound ideas revealed by modern science. Every person experiences the world through eyes that will age, change, and eventually close forever. Yet the developmental instructions responsible for building those eyes have traveled through an almost unimaginable chain of generations. Parents pass them to children. Children later become parents themselves. Across thousands upon thousands of generations, this transfer has continued without interruption. Each generation introduces new combinations through recombination and occasional mutation, but the underlying biological framework remains recognizable. The eye seen in the mirror today, therefore, belongs simultaneously to one individual and to an inheritance extending far beyond that individual's lifetime. Brown eyes illustrate this continuity particularly well because they remain the most common eye color across much of the world. Their familiarity can make them seem ordinary, even unremarkable. Familiarity, however, often hides history rather than revealing it. The most ancient biological processes are frequently the easiest to overlook precisely because they surround us every day. Breathing, healing, seeing, and growing all feel ordinary, yet each depends upon systems refined across immense stretches of evolutionary time. Pigmentation belongs to this same category. The production of melanin within the iris appears effortless because the underlying cellular machinery has been preserved through countless generations. Looking back toward the beginning of humanity reminds us that no generation inherited this system in isolation. The earliest members of our species received it from earlier human ancestors, who themselves inherited it from still older evolutionary lineages. Each generation modified small details while preserving the broader structure. Some inherited variants became more common, others gradually disappeared. Entire populations vanished without leaving direct descendants. Even so, enough continuity remained for the pigment system itself to survive. The brown eyes seen across the modern world therefore represent neither perfect preservation nor complete change. They are the latest expression of a process that has continually renewed itself while remaining connected to its deepest origins. This perspective also changes the meaning of ancestry. People often imagine ancestry as a collection of names recorded in family trees or historical documents. Those records rarely extend more than a few centuries into the past. biological ancestry reaches incomparably farther. Every living person carries genetic material inherited through generations so numerous that they cannot realistically be counted. Most of those ancestors are unknown. Their names have disappeared. Their languages are forgotten. Their homes have vanished beneath forests, deserts, oceans, or modern cities. Yet fragments of their biological inheritance continue within every living body. Brown eyes become one visible reminder of this invisible continuity. They do not preserve the faces of those ancient people, nor can they identify one particular ancestor among millions. Instead, they reveal that life itself continued across changing climates, migrations, and civilizations, quietly carrying ancient biological processes into the present. Seen in this way, the ordinary mirror becomes something unexpected. Looking into familiar brown eyes is not simply observing one person's appearance. It is witnessing the latest moment in an evolutionary story that began long before written history and has never truly stopped unfolding. The color itself may appear unchanged from one day to the next, but the inheritance behind it continues its patient journey into every future generation, linking lives separated by immense spans of time through one enduring biological tradition. When people stand before a mirror, they usually recognize the face, looking back almost instantly. The eyes seem especially familiar because they accompany every memory of childhood, every conversation, and every ordinary day. Yet familiarity can create an illusion of permanence. It becomes easy to believe that the features seen today have always existed exactly as they appear now. Evolution tells a quieter story. Every visible characteristic is the temporary expression of a biological process that has been changing, almost imperceptibly, across immense stretches of time. The eye itself appears stable within a single lifetime, but its history extends far beyond any individual memory. The iris offers an unusually clear example of this relationship between continuity and change. Its structure develops before birth through carefully coordinated stages directed by inherited genetic information. Pigment-producing cells gradually deposit melanin within the iris, creating the familiar appearance recognized as brown, hazel, green, grey, or blue. Once this developmental process is complete, the color usually remains relatively stable throughout adult life. To the individual, it feels constant. Across generations, however, the combinations of inherited variants responsible for that appearance continue to be reshuffled through reproduction. Every child receives a new genetic combination that has never existed in exactly the same form before. Continuity therefore exists alongside constant renewal. This balance has characterized human evolution from its earliest beginnings. Looking back toward the origins of our species makes that balance even more remarkable. The first populations of Homo sapiens did not know that hereditary information was carried within DNA. They understood families through observation rather than genetics. Children resembled parents. Certain traits appeared repeatedly within relatives. Others seemed to skip generations or emerge unexpectedly. These everyday experiences reflected biological mechanisms that would remain invisible until the modern scientific era. Long before anyone understood chromosomes or genes, inheritance had already been quietly linking one generation to the next. Brown eyes traveled through those family histories without announcing the extraordinary age of the biological systems behind them. Every generation added another link to an already ancient chain. Many individual family lines eventually disappeared, leaving no descendants. Others expanded across continents as populations migrated into new landscapes. Historical events repeatedly interrupted ordinary life. Climatic shifts altered migration routes. Epidemics reduced populations. New technologies changed patterns of settlement. Civilizations emerged, flourished, and declined. Through every period, biological inheritance continued its patient work beneath the surface of history. Most people never realized that the ordinary resemblance between parent and child represented one of the longest uninterrupted processes on Earth. The widespread presence of brown eyes today reflects that persistence. Their frequency is not simply the outcome of one ancient event preserved unchanged. Instead, it represents the cumulative result of countless generations successfully transmitting inherited biological information through changing environments and changing societies. Every brown iris visible today exists because an unbroken chain of reproduction connected the present with ancestors who lived far beyond the reach of written history. The individual people within that chain are mostly forgotten, but the biological continuity they sustained remains visible. This perspective encourages a different way of thinking about human identity. Modern life often emphasizes the uniqueness of each individual, and that uniqueness is real. Every genome is a distinctive combination of inherited variation. At the same time, every individual also represents continuity extending far beyond personal experience. A familiar pair of brown eyes belongs to one person, one family, and one lifetime, yet it also belongs to an evolutionary history shared with humanity as a whole. The mirror therefore reflects two stories simultaneously. One is immediate and personal. The other stretches across hundreds of thousands of years of inheritance that quietly continued, while languages changed, landscapes shifted, and civilizations came and went. The remarkable truth is that both stories are present in the same ordinary glance, waiting to be recognized not as separate histories, but as different scales of the same enduring human journey. That quiet continuity becomes even more meaningful when we remember how little of human history has actually been written down. The overwhelming majority of human lives unfolded long before the first symbols appeared on stone, clay, or parchment. Entire generations were born, raised children, grew old, and disappeared without leaving a single written record behind. Their names have been forgotten, their voices have faded into silence, and the places where they once gathered have often been reclaimed by forests, deserts, rivers, or the sea. Yet something from those forgotten lives never vanished. The biological inheritance they carried continued moving forward from parent to child with remarkable consistency, crossing countless generations until it eventually reached the people living today. Every familiar brown eye is part of that uninterrupted chain. It exists because life continued through periods of abundance and hardship, through changing climates, shifting landscapes, and the slow movement of human populations into new environments. Each generation inherited ancient biological systems that had already been shaped by deep evolutionary history, preserving them while also passing along new combinations created through ordinary reproduction. The people carrying those traits could not have known anything about genes, chromosomes, or DNA. They simply watched children resemble their parents and accepted inheritance as one of life's ordinary patterns. Modern science has given us the language to understand what they observed without explanation, but it has not changed the continuity itself. The same developmental processes that guided the formation of the iris in those distant ancestors continue operating within every child born today. Cells still follow inherited genetic instructions. Melanin still accumulates within the iris through familiar biological pathways. The eye still develops according to patterns refined across immense spans of evolutionary time. What has changed is not the existence of those processes, but our ability to recognize the extraordinary history quietly contained within them. Looking across the immense timeline of Homo sapiens also changes the way ordinary appearance is understood. History often celebrates dramatic events because they are easy to remember. Great migrations, powerful kingdoms, technological discoveries, and cultural achievements occupy the pages of books and the halls of museums. Yet none of those events would have been possible without something far more consistent taking place beneath them. Every civilization depended upon families, every family depended upon children, every child inherited biological systems that had already survived through countless earlier generations. The continuity of life itself made every later achievement possible. Brown eyes did not shape the rise of civilizations, but they accompanied humanity through every one of them, carried forward by ordinary people whose individual stories were rarely recorded, but whose descendants continued the unbroken chain of inheritance. Looking even farther back, beyond agriculture and beyond the earliest settlements, reveals how small recorded history truly is compared with the age of our species. Before cities existed, before permanent villages appeared, and before writing transformed memory into history, human beings were already adapting to changing environments, forming communities, raising families, and passing inherited variation into the future. The pigment-producing systems responsible for brown eyes belong to those ancient populations just as they belong to people today. Their persistence reflects not one dramatic evolutionary event, but the quiet success of biological continuity across hundreds of thousands of years. Every modern brown iris, therefore, carries evidence of survival rather than spectacle. It reminds us that the longest human story is not written in monuments or preserved only inside museums. It is written within living bodies that continue transmitting ancient biological information from one generation to the next. Perhaps that is the most meaningful conclusion reached so far. The familiar eyes reflected in a mirror each morning are connected to a history so vast that no individual mind can fully imagine it. They reveal that the deepest links to humanity's earliest origins do not depend upon extraordinary discoveries alone. They also exist within the ordinary features carried by millions of people every day, quietly preserving the continuity of life across a span of time that stretches far beyond memory, while remaining present in every glance exchanged between human beings today. Perhaps the most comforting realization is that this continuity belongs equally to every person alive today. No matter where someone is born, which language they speak, or what color their eyes happen to be, every human life begins through the same long inheritance that has connected one generation to the next since the earliest chapters of our species. The visible differences that catch our attention occupy only a small part of that inheritance. Beneath them lies an extraordinary biological foundation shared across humanity, built through millions of years of evolution and carried forward through the much more recent history of Homo sapiens. Brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes, and every shade between them are different expressions of that common foundation rather than separate stories competing with one another. Throughout this journey, the question hidden inside the title has slowly changed its meaning. At first, it seemed to ask whether brown eyes concealed a forgotten secret from 500,000 years ago. The evidence has pointed towards something both simpler and far more profound. The secret is not that brown eyes possess unusual abilities or preserve mysterious knowledge unavailable to other people. The real discovery is that an ordinary biological trait can quietly preserve the record of extraordinary continuity. Every brown iris reminds us that life rarely depends upon dramatic transformations alone. More often, it depends upon countless successful repetitions of ordinary events. Parents raise children. Children become parents in turn. Inherited biological information continues its journey. Generation after generation, the chain remains unbroken, even while individual lives begin and end. Modern science has given us remarkable tools for understanding this process. Genetics allows researchers to study inheritance with a precision unimaginable only a century ago. Archaeology reveals traces of communities whose names have long been forgotten. Ancient DNA provides glimpses into populations separated from the present by thousands of years. Evolutionary biology explains how inherited variation accumulates and changes through time. Each field contributes a different perspective, yet they all arrive at a similar conclusion. Humanity is connected by a shared evolutionary history that is far older than recorded civilization and far more continuous than the divisions people sometimes imagine between themselves. Looking once more toward our earliest origins brings this understanding gently back to the present. The first members of Homo sapiens could not know that distant descendants would one day investigate their lives through fossils, genetics, and careful scientific reasoning. They simply lived within the world available to them, adapting to changing environments while passing life forward. Their greatest legacy was not a monument or a written language, it was continuity itself. Because that continuity endured, every later generation had the opportunity to build new knowledge upon ancient biological foundations. Our own understanding of brown eyes is therefore one small result of an inheritance that has never completely stopped unfolding. This perspective also encourages a quiet sense of humility. Every living person represents only one brief moment within a history extending across hundreds of thousands of years. None of us stands at the beginning of the story, and none of us will witness its ending. We each receive an inheritance shaped by innumerable lives that came before, and we pass part of that inheritance into futures we will never see. The ordinary brown eye, so familiar that it often escapes notice, becomes a gentle reminder of this larger truth. It asks us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as participants in an unbroken human journey that has crossed changing climates, expanding continents, disappearing populations, and the rise and fall of civilizations. Perhaps that is the quiet gift hidden within such an ordinary feature. It invites patience instead of certainty, curiosity instead of myth, and respect for the evidence that allows humanity to understand its own past a little more clearly with each passing generation, while always leaving room for future discoveries that may deepen, refine, and enrich the story even further. And perhaps that is the gentlest place for this long journey to come to rest. The question that first invited our curiosity has never really been about choosing one eye color over another or searching for a dramatic secret hidden inside the human face. It has been about learning to recognize that even the most ordinary parts of ourselves can carry histories so deep that they stretch beyond imagination. Brown eyes have accompanied our species through changing climates, through migrations that slowly reshape the world, through the birth of languages, the rise of civilizations, and the passing of generations whose names have long since disappeared. They have remained familiar not because history stood still, but because life itself continued, quietly preserving ancient biological systems while allowing humanity to adapt, explore, and change. Modern science has not removed the wonder from that story. It has simply replaced speculation with evidence, allowing curiosity to rest upon observations gathered through genetics, archaeology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. Those discoveries remind us that reliable knowledge does not become valuable because it promises certainty in every detail. It becomes valuable because it is willing to change when stronger evidence appears, while remaining honest about the questions that have not yet been fully answered. That willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads is one of humanity's greatest achievements, for it allows each generation to understand a little more than the one before without pretending that the search has reached its final destination. Looking back across everything we have explored, the hidden secret within brown eyes is no longer mysterious in the way the title may have first suggested. It is quieter, older, and perhaps more meaningful. The secret is continuity. Every ordinary glance carries the result of an inheritance passed carefully through countless generations. Every familiar iris reflects biological systems that survive changing environments, shifting populations, and immense stretches of time. Every child born today receives that inheritance in a new and unique combination, ensuring that the story continues while never repeating itself in exactly the same way again. There is something deeply reassuring in that thought. Although individual lives are brief, they are never completely isolated from the larger history of humanity. Each person belongs to a chain that reaches back toward our earliest ancestors and extends forward into generations that have not yet been born. We inherit more than genes alone. We inherit the accumulated success of life, finding ways to continue despite uncertainty, despite environmental change, and despite the countless challenges that shape the human journey. Brown eyes, like every other human eye, quietly remind us of that enduring connection every time they open to greet a new morning or close at the end of a long day. As this story gently comes to an end, perhaps the most valuable lesson is not about pigmentation, genetics, or even evolution by themselves. It is about learning to see familiar things with greater patience and deeper appreciation. The ordinary often becomes extraordinary once enough time is placed behind it. A feature so common that millions of people rarely think about it can become a doorway into the history of our species, revealing that the deepest connections between the present and the distant past are often hidden in plain sight. If this journey has offered anything worth carrying forward, let it be a quiet respect for careful evidence, an enduring curiosity about the natural world, and a renewed awareness that every human face reflects a history far older than memory. And perhaps, the next time you happen to notice a pair of brown eyes, whether they belong to someone you love, a stranger passing by, or the familiar reflection waiting in the mirror, you may pause for just a moment and remember that you are looking at one small part of an unbroken story that began long before any of us arrived, and that will continue in ways none of us can fully predict, long after we are gone. So as the night grows quieter and these thoughts gradually settle into the background, one gentle question still remains, waiting without demanding an answer. What ordinary part of ourselves might be carrying the next great story that humanity has not yet learned to see?